Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Jared. So we're now going to have a look at the book of Genesis for the next few minutes. As we've already said, the book of Genesis is it was described as the seedbed for the Bible. Many of the ideas and fundamental principles in the Bible have their foundations in Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible, as we see the Bible tree there. And really it can be divided into two sections. The first 11 chapters deal with what's called the primeval history. So the formation of the world as we know it today, the formation of the earth, creation, the fall of man, and the flood is quite a big part of that section, and on to how languages were formed. And then the rest of the book deals with the patriarchal history. The word patriarch simply means father. So this deals with the fathers of the nation of Israel, and particularly four individuals of the same family: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And that's listed for you in your workbooks on page 13. So that just gives a structure really for how the book is put together. And there we have the four key elements of each of those two sections. So the primeval history, it begins with creation in Genesis 1 and 2, how God formed the earth. Then the next couple of chapters deal with the first people, humans on earth, Adam and Eve, and how they sinned, brought sin and death into the world, and the consequences of that falling on the rest of mankind. Then we have the flood, as I mentioned, Noah and the ark, a story that I'm sure many of us are very familiar with. And then there's that section on the confusing of tongues at the Tower of Babel. Prior to that, all humans had spoken the same language, but from that point, the languages of the earth were created, and the people were divided in that sense. And then there's the patriarchal history with those four individuals, as I mentioned, and the formation of the nation of Israel, which then forms a key part of the rest of the Old Testament. And in addition to that natural separation into those two sections, again in your workbooks there's listed a series of natural breaks, and it gives the divisions of where the chapters of these sections are. So the first one, if I just pick this up, the first one, creation, chapters 1 and 2, and then it's split into a series of generations. So the generations of the heaven and earth for the next couple of chapters, and then the generations of Adam, the first man, and so on, Noah and the sons of Noah, and so forth. And those are all phrases in those verses that are listed to the side, the generations of. So that's a further division of that book. Just to help you as you read the book for yourself, it's useful to know what section you're in, what period in history, and the context of the passages you're reading. And this chart may help with that as well. You can see on the screen. Again, I think we saw this last week, the time chart of the Old Testament. And circled in red there is the section covered by Genesis. And as you can see, it's a large part of that history, over 2,000 years. So that's a background, really, and a structure of the book, which may help you to understand the context as you read through it. And again, as we've said, there are many key points and principles from Genesis. And again, in your workbook is listed a few key points to consider. For example, creation challenging evolution, and God's first promises to man, and how the promises to Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob, and Joseph applied throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, and can still apply to us. So that's a bit of a background to the book of Genesis. Now we'd like to have a look at, and go into more detail into the account of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. And the way we want to approach this is to demonstrate the importance of seeing patterns in the Bible. The writings of the Bible aren't just things that can be read, just a narrative that can be read and see the surface meaning. There are often layered meanings and lessons. On the surface, of course, very importantly, we have the narrative and we have the lessons at face value which are being taught. But underneath that, there's more links and patterns that we can see to demonstrate further lessons, further principles about God or about the future or what He expects of us. And so what we want to do is delve a bit deeper into the account of creation in Genesis and chapter 1. So if you come there with me, please, to Genesis 1. The first book in the Bible, first chapter, shouldn't be the hardest to find, hopefully. And we're going to have a look at how we can read this passage carefully to see that there's more than just an account of what was created. So, Genesis chapter 1, and I'll just skim down a few of the verses here to see what was created on what day, first of all. And as we go through, I want you to think carefully and see if there are any links between any of the days, any similarities between what is being created. So, verse 3, first of all then. And God said, this is the first day, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So the first day God created light. Verse 6, God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so, and God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. So what's happening there is that God is dividing the waters between the waters which are on the earth, so the seas, the oceans, to the waters which are in the sky, so clouds, in whatever form they were in at this time. So the skies and seas are being formed at this point. And then the third day, in verse 9, God says, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called He seas. And God saw that it was good. So on the third day, God separates the sea from the dry land, and so dry land appears. And then in verse 11, He creates the plants as well. Okay, so that's the first 3 days. So, day 4, in verse 14, God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven. Well, that starts to sound a bit similar to day 1. Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, for seasons, for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the sun, and the lesser light to rule the night, the moon. And He made the stars also. Okay, then day 5, verse 20, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. So on the 5th day, God creates the birds and the fish. And then the 6th day, in verse 24, God said, let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle, creeping thing, beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so, and man is included, is also created, and that's in chapter 2 we have more detail of the creation of man. And then on the 7th day God rests, of course, in chapter 2 and verse 2. On the 7th day God ended His work which He had made, and He rested on the 7th day. So that's creation. On the surface, it just tells us, I say it just tells us, obviously it's very important, but it tells us what God created on what day. But there's more to it. So I said if we could try to link any of those 2 days together. On day 1, light was created. Not a physical object or life, just light. And then on day 4, lights, plural, were created, which are the sun, the moon and the stars. So physical objects were created, but to fulfill the purpose of day 1. And then, I don't know if you noticed, day 2 created the skies and the seas. Day 5 created birds and the fish to fill the skies and the seas. So again, on day 2, nothing was created physically, but there was a separation of waters above and below, and then that was filled on day 5. And then day 3 and 6, day 3 the land was created, or was separated from the sea. Again, no physical creation, but there was a separation. And then on day 6, the creatures are created to fill the earth. Okay, so that's all very interesting, but what does that really mean? I've put on the screen there, Genesis 1 verse 2, and that tells us the state of the earth before God created light on the first day. So before the creation happened, or before light was created, the first act of creation, it says that the earth was without form and void. So there's 2 descriptions there. It was without form and it was void. And those 2 really mean what they say. It was without form, there was no structure. That's the idea of confusion. There was no structure that could support life. And it was void, empty. There was no life. So there's a difference there between those 2 descriptions. One, there was no structure to support life. Secondly, there was no life. And so then if we put that in the context of the 6 days, the 7 days, but the 7th day God rested, so the 6 days, we see that there are 2 sets of 3 days, which I've just tried to explain, that the first 3 aren't physically creating objects. The first 3 are creating the environment for the life to live, and then the second set of 3 days are creating that life. And that shows us that the 2 problems, if you like, with the earth before creation happened are being resolved. So the earth was without form and void, there was no structure and there was no life. God saw this and decided to change that situation. And so on the first 3 days, God created a structure. He gave it a form by creating light, by creating the sky and the seas, and by creating or revealing dry land. And it was empty. It was void. It had no life. And so on the second 3 days, God resolves that problem by creating the sun, moon and stars to give that light, and then by creating the life in the sky and the seas, the birds and the fish, and then by creating the land animals to fill the earth. And so what on the surface was a narrative describing what was created and when, and may have seemed a little random as to the order and as to what was created when and what was combined with what on which day. What we actually see is by reading more carefully and by looking for patterns in the Bible, we see that there is a structure and that there is organisation to what God was doing. God was resolving these 2 issues across the 2 sets of 3 days. And this is just one example of a pattern in the Bible. There are hundreds, thousands, infinitely more. And what this really shows to us, I think, this particular pattern, is that God doesn't do things at random. God isn't impulsive or unstructured. When God sets out to resolve a problem, there is a plan and a structure. And there has been a plan ever since before creation began. There was a plan for creation and there was a plan beyond creation, and that plan is still being outworked today. And so, by looking for these patterns these progressions, these links throughout the Bible. Hopefully that would help us to understand God's plan, to understand more about what the meanings are underneath the surface of the things that we read. I hope that made sense. If not, please ask me afterwards and I'll try and explain it in a different way. But what I'm really trying to demonstrate there is that there's more to just looking at what's on the surface. We've already said that it takes more reading and more understanding and research to really understand the message. And one of the ways of doing that, I think, is to look for these kind of patterns and progressions and these sorts of tables that can be created to really show the structure that God works within and has showed us in his scriptures. And so I'll hand back over to Jared for the next.